is perfect.
Go home.
Yeah, that's always a lie. So a lot of this, you'll see a lot of the section is going to talk about how we work together. So one of the secrets of game design, at least from my point of view, is you can create a game on your own, and that's definitely something you can try to do. But whenever you're working on any big, larger project, you've got to work with other people. And in my experience, it's probably half of it is learning how to work well with others. Because it is a creative process, so it's very easy to feel like, well, this is what I made. I don't want people to tear it down. It's creating an environment where people can feel, hey, I have trust. Everyone working with me wants the game to be great. We're all on the same page. That ties back to that earlier stuff about having a really strong vision. So everyone knows, here's what we're here to build. So anyone can understand, hey, if this might be an interesting idea, but it doesn't work for our game, because that's not what our game is about, or that's not what we're trying to do. So a lot of our stuff was, how do we get everyone working on the team to work together? And in my professional experience, that's the most difficult thing. Most people can, if they're working in games, can spot a good game, can tell the difference between a good game and a bad game, or can understand this game, I might not like it, but I can understand why it's a good game. It's really learning to work with other people. I think is one of the most challenging things. Just having that sense of collaboration and building that sense of trust. And probably one of the biggest things we screwed up was finding a way to apportion out a game the size of Dungeons & Dragons in a way that everyone understood, here's what I'm responsible for, and here's what someone else is responsible for, and here's how all that ties together. What'll happen, I think what did happen, at least in our experience, was there would be cases where something might not be working, but no one would quite understand, well, who's in charge of fixing that? Who's the person who's going to make sure this gets dealt with or improved or implemented without stepping on a lot of toes? Or we're doing it in a way that's going to be congruent with everything else we're doing. Or even just communicating that change. So everyone knows, this is now working this way, and there's a reason why. That wasn't a mistake. One of the things I think in tabletop gaming, and if you feel the same way, that's trickier, say, compared to digital gaming is, when you're writing code, if your code doesn't compile, then clearly there's a mistake, right? Or if you're playing your World War II, naval combat sim, and you sink a ship, and it starts to float up into the air, because you reversed, it's supposed to be going down and you reverse the direction. It's going up. You can clearly see that. What will happen in tabletop gaming, though, is you really have to understand the designer's intent to know if the thing that the designer just wrote is correct or not. Because there is no compiler. The rule can say whatever it wants. It's going to essentially run, and especially with a role-playing game, a lot of times in our playtests, dungeon masters would just sort of correct things on the fly. You might have a rule that's horribly broken. It doesn't make any sense, but it looks truthy. It looks kind of correct. And so the dungeon masters who know your design are going to run it the way you intended. And then as soon as you give it to someone who doesn't personally know you or sit across the room from you, the thing completely collapses. So that was one of the things, and a lot of that kind of tied into the second one, internal transparency. Everyone understanding why things were the way they were. Balancing that with every time we made a change, we could have written a 3-page memo on why we made this change. Then nothing would get done. But if we were just silent, you fall back into the entire thing. So a great example would be in 5th edition, we don't really have the concept of flanking. In earlier editions, if you had 2 guys, opposite sides of a monster, that was flanking, you get combat advantage in 4th, or a +2 bonus, your flanking bonus in 3rd. We didn't have that. Well, someone reading the rulebook could think, well, wait a sec, did they mean to leave this out? Is there supposed to be flanking? And if I add flanking to the game, am I doing it right? Or do they mean to leave this out? And that kind of question where, a DM might just start running the game with flanking. A playtest DM might do that. And then send us feedback that says, well, combat was way crazy, because everyone was getting advantage all the time because they were flanking, and that advantage is broken, because advantage is too big of a bonus to be giving out when people are flanking.
And by the way, this is a piece of feedback we actually got.
Yeah, and so it'd be
he's using a real example.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting, but we don't have flanking in our game. So, and then you have to wonder, well, the rest of the feedback from this playtest group, what does it actually mean? What's actually happening here? And so having that real, at tabletop gaming especially, you need that real transparency to understand the intent behind things. But again, balancing that between knowing there's a lot of people working the project. You don't want people to spend all their time just reading memos about why things are the way they are, to the point where we're not actually doing anything. We're just explaining what we might do. And so and I think it's something that's still an ongoing thing for us.
Yeah.
And in tabletop gaming in general, I think, is understanding how do I get my design intent out there so that everyone understands it, that no one's kind of working at cross purposes, with everyone else.
Yeah, and part of what caused these first two issues especially is that we have a much smaller team than we've ever had before for a project of this scale, right? And so not only was it tough to find areas of ownership because you kind of had to own a lot of different things, right? I mean, very early on, I was designing classes, races, monsters, all these different things. And eventually, as the game matured and as we got closer and closer to release, we could find those areas of ownership, right? Like I took a lot of the ownership of the math behind the game, and Chris Perkins was obviously leading the monster manual, so he took a lot of monster ownership, right? Over time, those developed, but early on, we were all having to be jack of all trades because we didn't have, twice as many or 3 times as many people as we did before. So just having to learn how to do that as a smaller group was I mean, that was, I would say, at least the first year of the process.
Though I would say having a smaller team compared to fourth was actually a strength for us.
Yeah.
Because it did make things like the transparency we were able to achieve and the things like the 3 pillars were easier to get out there. There were fewer opportunities for things to go wrong. Yeah. It's really funny. I think there's kind of a correct number for any project. There's the right number of people. Yeah. And you can have too many or too few, and both of them are probably equally bad. You're too few and everyone's doing too much work, quality drops. Too many, and you're spending a lot of your time trying to just explain, well, here's what we're supposed to be doing, and once one communication link breaks down, the entire project can fall apart.
Right. Well, I think what helped us, though, was bullet point number 3 here. We didn't do it great all the time, but the fact that we did have a small core team, but then we also had 200,000 people out there that were helping us playtest this, right? Yeah. So we had to learn how to, I mean, it's a very different process. We had to learn how to turn all of our playtesters into the invisible 9th member of our team, or however many people we had working on it, right? And that was something we'd never had to do before, right? So it was this combination of using fewer internal people and using more external people. There were a lot of growing pains involved in that.
And we also worked with contractors who were freelance. Right. Yep. And we actually hit a point where we stopped asking them to do any real serious heavy lifting. And it's hard, because for a lot of people, like, this is their chance to work on an edition of D&D. This is a great dream job. But you realize that we realized essentially that keeping them in the loop was a lot more work than we could actually spend time doing. And we weren't doing them any favors, because you had people either through miscommunication or they didn't quite understand how things worked, doing a lot of work, and then you have to have the hard discussion of, well, thanks for putting 50 hours into this, but we can't use any of it because you made these 2 faulty assumptions, because we weren't really clear with how this was working. And so it was, at the end, we really pared it down to just working with people who were in the building face to face. Because I think at the end of the day, that communication was really important.
Yeah, things were changing so rapidly that by the time I finished writing up the design guidelines for this thing, we might have changed those design guidelines. Yeah. And so that was tough. And then overcoming designer biases, this is just, I mean, this is a thing that every designer has to deal with, right? We played through every edition of D&D, but I'm more firmly rooted in 2nd edition than 1st edition, for example, right? So a lot of my personal biases come from how I was shaped as a D&D gamer. So it was a constant struggle for me and for every designer on the team to, every time you're evaluating something, a game mechanic, a piece of feedback, whatever, is a constant struggle to look at that feedback or look at that game mechanic and then ask yourself, do I like or not like this because it is inherently good, bad, whatever, or because my biases are changing the way that I view that thing, right? So there's this sort of constant self-evaluation that had to take place as well, and we struggled with it a lot of times. I mean, there were many, many times where we'd be in a heated argument, and I would realize, you know what, I'm actually just arguing this because my personal way of thinking about D&D is clouding my judgment, and you have to kind of step back and say, okay, we need to go away from this room, I need to think about it some more, and we can come back and talk about it later.
Yeah, and that goes back to, I think, it's something unique when you're working on a game as old as D&D, that you do have an audience that has a real stake, they're fans of the franchise, they know what they want. You can't stray too far from that. It's definitely a balancing act between wanting to introduce new things, but knowing those things have to be things that are making the game measurably better for the people playing the game and the future people who are going to come in to play the game. And so, yeah, there are times you have to look at it and think, well, from a pure elegance standpoint, maybe this is a better, quote-unquote better thing, but you realize we have to use the measurement that's the audience, not just our own personal biases.
Yeah. So just a few more things that we really struggled with that we want to touch on. So we've already mentioned keeping up with design standards is a big part of our struggles, just because it's difficult to document something that was constantly in flux, and then trying to disseminate that documentation to contractors and playtesters and 100,000 playtesters, et cetera. it was difficult for us to pull off. I don't know that we ever really got to that point until we stopped making so many changes in the game, right? So the volume of changes we were making was making it difficult to keep up with those design standards. You want to talk about tunnel vision a little bit?
Yeah, well, with a project of this size, it's very easy to think that your local design problem or work is the design problem and the work that needs to get done. So part of it is keeping those communication channels open and understanding the broader strategic context of what you're doing. So it might sound really cool if you're working on new spells for the wizard to do 100 new spells when you needed 10. Like, oh, great, A+, did 10 times as much work. Well, the editor or the final designer who now has to go through those 100 spells, who has maybe one 8-hour workday to do that, who's planning on going on through 10 spells, now has to go through 100. And more often than not, in that case, we'll just send it back and say, give me your 10 best, things like that. Really understanding, and this kind of ties a little bit to the biases thing from earlier, but understanding that there's a holistic whole to the game, and that's what we're always trying to serve. And it's hard because sometimes it's very easy to go, well, here's, this will work really great. The person playing the fighter is going to have a great time, and their turns are going to be 10 minutes long each, and everyone else is going to be bored. I think that's probably a good way to think of it, is always thinking of how does everything work together in the big picture. And again, it's very easy to lose track of that, especially in a game where very naturally the design process is going to break down, that Rodney's going to design the fighter, and I'm going to design the barbarian, and Chris is going to design the bard. It's easy to think, oh, my class is the most important one. You actually kind of see this in fiction when you have a shared world in fiction. If writer A writes a novel where the king dies, then writer B wants to write a novel where a god dies, and then writer C wants to write a novel where the world dies, right? Like, it's always this little bit of a one-upsmanship. I don't think it's anything like, like a rivalry where I want to outdo someone. It's just like, oh, the bar's been raised. Okay, I want to do even better than that. Yeah. And kind of knowing when to kind of step away and go, no, this is working fine. We don't need to spend another week revising this class that we revised 5 times, because the playtesters are happy with it. And, and things like that. So always kind of keep an eye on the system as a whole. You can almost think of it as you have a progress bar. You have all your little individual project progress bars, but your real goal is to get the entire project as a whole's progress bar to 100%, A+, double good, awesome, good job.
So despite the fact that we had 3 years of work on this game, we did eventually end up in a bit of a crunch near the end. And so one of the things that we really struggled with was not basically reverting to all those old habits that we've already mentioned during crunch time. It's very easy to get caught up in, okay, we just got to get that progress bar to 100%. So forget everything that we've learned up to this point. I'm just going to do it the old way because that's the safe way. That's how I know how to do it. That's how we've always done it, right? And so it was constantly having to remind ourselves, you know what? We've tried to put in place new processes. We've tried to put in place new ways of doing things. And that was a big struggle for us, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not really much more to say than that, right? And then, of course, when we started the process, we were just making a game, right? We weren't even making a player's handbook or a monster manual. We were just making the core game system. We were making some classes, and we were making some spells, and aren't these things great? And then the cold bucket of ice water was thrown in our faces. It was like, you know what, guys? We actually have to make these into books. And so when we started getting into the making of the actual products, that's when we ran into a few more issues. And I think you could probably talk about this a little bit better, like with the starter set and everything.
Oh, yeah, the starter set. The starter set. So a lot of it really is, at the end of the day, you have this really great system. And it's almost like the book is like our UI. It's like, we have this great engine, and our UI is it's command line, which we know because, hey, we made it. So it's pretty easy. So here you go, like, play the game. It's like, well, now we actually need to make this and present this in a way that people who aren't us and aren't hardcore enough to want to playtest the game could actually play the game and understand it. And so we had some elements here, since we wanted to make the game streamlined, make it easier to pick up, faster to play. That was helping us. But then actually now taking a step back and having to write text that says, here's how you play this game. And how can we put that together in a product that people will actually want to give us money for? Because one of our things was to think, we want each of the core rulebooks in our tabletop role-playing game products going forward to just be entertaining on their own. That if you buy a monster manual, it should just be fun to read. And that was the kind of thing that kind of came in at the 11th hour because we'd been working on the system, getting everything working. Okay, the system's working. Now it's like we have this person who's like perfectly functional as a human, and now we need them to like put on a great show. Like they need to like dance and sing and do all this cool stuff and keep people entertained. And that kind of came in pretty late in the process. And a lot of that was just how we wanted to present things, the art, the layout, all that design stuff and bringing it in. And that's something where actually I think in the end, we did a really good job. I was really happy with how it turned out.
The end result is fine.
Yeah, but there's a lot of things where it's like, well, we got kind of lucky. I kind of go back to the idea like, if you haven't done your homework, you're kind of rolling the dice. And there were a couple places we were stuck doing that. Things seemed to have bounced our way. The starter set was probably the most difficult.
Yeah.
Where we, how do we make a package where we had said early on, it's going to be an adventure levels 1 to 5. Like, we need to get people playing the game. Dungeons & Dragons is a game where if someone describes it to you, it may not actually sound very fun. But once you start playing it, it's actually very fun. So it's one of the things where we knew right out of the gate, we wanted people who bought the starter set to cut down the barrier between buying that product and actually starting to play. Because their feeling was, if you actually start playing a tabletop role-playing game, it's going to completely open up your eyes like, wow, this is a great new type of game I had never played before, especially for those new players. Existing players, we knew, okay, they're going to buy the player's handbook. If they do buy the starter set, they're going to be buying it for a friend or somebody they want to get into D&D, and they're probably going to go to Amazon and say, well, 3 stars, it's okay, but it's not the full game. And we're fine with that. Actually seeing the reviews kind of trended lower for the starter set was what we expected. I kind of felt like, in the way we looked at the product, if hardcore existing tabletop role players said, this is an awesome starter set, we had probably completely screwed up. Because we're making people who already knew how to play D&D happy with the thing that was supposed to be aimed at the people who didn't know how to play D&D. So that was definitely a big barrier. And then part of it, too, for us was kind of coming to the realization that D&D actually is nowhere near as hard as we think it is. I think there's something that happens when you become an expert on something. Like if you played a lot of tabletop games or a lot of any type of game, you get to know all the things that could go wrong. And because you know all the things that can go wrong, you know how to avoid them and how to run a good game. And when you first start playing something, you don't know all that stuff. And there's actually a really good chance if you try to explain all that stuff to someone that it's going to make them not want to play. Because all they're hearing is, here's everything that could go wrong. And don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. Instead, what you want to focus on is do these things. And yes, you're going to make mistakes. That's part of becoming an expert, is screwing up. My first game designs were terrible, right? The first time I tried writing anything, it's terrible, right? I mean, it's a rare person who just instantly does something as an expert. But part of that, attaining that mastery, I think, is part of the actual fun of turning something into a hobby. You get to look back and go, hey, I used to be worse at this, and now I'm better at it. So really, we embraced that with the starter set. It's much leaner than I think people expected. But we found with people who haven't played D&D before, it's actually enough to get them going. But that was something which there's a little luck involved there, which I'm happy, hey, I'll take it. But it did not get the same level of attention to detail as the core system did.